Migration can have a profound impact on society, including the people you live with and how they live together. In a previous video, I talked about which decisions are most suitable for direct democracy, where the population would be able to vote on key decisions. Migration and citizenship was one of the most suitable and relevant decision topic areas. A subsequent question we then need to answer is who should be involved in decisions on migration. You could include everyone who is in society or a subset of the population. Imagine a country had 1 million people and they invited another 2 million people to live in the country, all within 1 year. The original population that existed before migration happened aren't happy with the outcomes from that change. They then decide to have a migration vote with a new population of 3 million people. As you can imagine, this approach is likely going to be problematic, as the migrants would likely vote to stay. There's little incentive for them to reduce their optionality, especially if their quality of life is better in this country than where they came from. This voting approach and outcome isn't fair on the historical population who's actually built the society in the first place. The historical population are now left in a position where they wouldn't be able to reverse the change using a simple democratic vote. The answer to this problem is the new population of migrants wouldn't be included in the vote. Obviously, this is a trivially simplistic example, but this does bring us to the important topic of thinking about the criteria you could use to determine who is involved in setting migration policy and how migration outcomes can be reversed. One way you could determine who gets to vote on migration policy is based on identity. Identity could mean selecting people based on things like ancestry and bloodline. Identities could also share similarities in genetics, heritage, and culture. There's two key population groups that I want to mention. The first is indigenous populations, along with long-established native populations. Indigenous means people with historical continuity to a place before colonization or any state formation. Long-established natives are the communities that have been in a location for the longest and most extended period of time. As an example of these, Native Americans are an indigenous population, whereas the English in England are long-established natives. The second group we should mention is settler populations. These are people who moved into a territory as part of colonization. Often this involved the creation of a sovereign nation state, along with political and economic structures. A reason why it's important to make a distinction between these two groups is that settler populations could be living with indigenous populations. If a settler population is bigger than the indigenous or long-established native one, there is a risk that a democratic system could lead to the suppression of the historically established population. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about this factor at the moment, but it's just something you need to think about when considering who is involved in deciding migration-related decisions when using identity. Another way you could determine who is going to vote on migration-related decisions is based on time. You could include people that have lived somewhere for at least a certain period of time, such as 20 years or 40 years. It could also be something like 100 years, which in practice would likely mean you need to be a descendant from someone who lived in that country in the past. A final approach to consider could be contribution. Those that have contributed the most to society or that have reached a minimum threshold of contribution could be included in the migration decision. These are some of the most obvious approaches that you could use to determine who is included in a migration-related decision. Citizenship is another approach to consider. However, this often represents one or a combination of the previous approaches, such as through identity via ancestry, time spent in the country, or contribution. And existing citizenships may not reflect the actual preferences of the indigenous, long-established native, or settler populations. Those populations may want to change the criteria for existing citizenships and revoke existing ones after they realize that they would prefer not to live with certain communities, and that could be due to differences, conflict, or just their personal preferences. Identity, time, and contribution are the three most compelling approaches for determining who is involved in migration policy. But which approach is the most compelling? If you want to protect genetics, ancestry, heritage, and culture, The answer is identity. Time or contribution doesn't prevent other communities from outbreeding the original population and then replacing them over the long term. Identity is also the most compelling way to retain social cohesion and unity by ensuring that the population that have been there the longest and that built the society in the first place can protect their identity and live with others that share their ancestry and those that embrace their own culture. Both time and contribution are reasonable approaches for determining migration policy, but they are not as suitable or reliable if you do want to protect genetics, ancestry, heritage, and culture. A multicultural society with a simple democratic system means you have enabled the democratic breeding and migration game. I'll talk about this in another video. The majority has power over the minority. So demographics is everything when you use a simple one person, one vote democratic system. Genetics, ancestry, heritage, and culture can all be replaced due to the different levels of breeding within each community in a multicultural society. So these are some of the things that you need to take into account when deciding who should determine migration policy. Now let's think about reversing migration. And this is important. It's difficult to predict all of the outcomes that might occur due to migration policy decisions. Some migration might work, and it could be accepted and embraced by a society. But not all migration leads to positive outcomes for a society. Genetics, ancestry, and culture are not equal across the world, and these differences can result in negative ramifications for a society that decides to invite a wide diversity of migrants into their own nation. Due to this reality, societies need to be able to reverse migration decisions if the historical population would prefer to return to a previous state of existence. If they can't do this, then this can easily lead to ongoing disputes and conflict that could continue to degrade society over time. If you invited someone to live in your home and it didn't work out, would it make sense for that person to be part of the decision of who is going to leave? If the new person isn't contributing towards paying rent, well, that makes the decision a bit easier. But what if they are also paying rent? Both tenants are contributing towards the household. Well, in that case, now time becomes the more obvious deciding factor. Who's lived in the home for the longest? And these same situations and considerations are what migration policy needs to handle. Both the policies for inviting people in, but also the policies for asking them to leave. The problems for many countries at the moment is a democratic republic style of government has been setting the migration policies by themselves. Representatives that were elected to run government only represent a tiny fraction of the population. Many countries have experienced a situation where migrants have been invited into their communities, but the population was never asked in a democratic vote whether they approve of this change, and that they accept the long-term ramifications of that change. Worse than that, in a number of cases, there is even evidence that the population didn't want this migration in the first place, or at least migration anywhere near the scale that it happened. This is an example of a democratically illegitimate outcome. Migration that might have never happened if the population was able to vote on this vitally important decision. If the decision was not democratically legitimate in the first place, it means the outcomes were not based on the actual preferences of the population. This situation would mean the visas and citizenships that have been given out would also not be legitimate. Outcomes like this are unfair on the historical population. It is the historical population that must decide whether to reverse migration or not. Similar to how it is the same population that should have decided whether anyone else was allowed to live in the society in the first place. Being able to reverse migration is also one of the only ways to reliably protect a population's identity over the long term, which means they can protect their genetics, ancestry, heritage, and culture. We're going to talk about genetic, ancestral, heritage, and cultural-based differences in more detail in the next video. But until then, I'll see you soon.